Hey guys, it's Miss Horton from North Pontotoc, and today we're going to look at the story of Gregor Mendel and his peas. This story can be found in your packet if you picked it up, and first we're going to start out by looking at heredity. Heredity is the passing of genetic traits from parent to offspring, and generally we are going to look at humans passing down traits from parent to child, but it started with Gregor Mendel looking at pea plants. But we see it all the time when someone has a baby and everybody starts saying, oh, who do they look like? So they'll, get out the baby pictures and they'll say, oh, look, she looks like her mom. You see it here. The grandmother looks like the mother, or the daughter looks like the dad. And they'll compare the pictures side by side and say how much she looks like her dad. So today I'm going to tell you the story of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel is known as the father of modern genetics. He was born way back in 1822, and he was a monk from Austria. He is the one who actually took the time to study heredity. Before this, no one had taken the time to actually see how certain traits were passed down from a parent to an offspring, no matter if it was a parent from a human or a plant. He experimented with pea plants to see how certain traits were passed down for patterns, no matter if it was the height or a certain color and things like that. He was the first one to study heredity. Gregor Mendel, often called the father of genetics, was a teacher, lifelong learner, scientist, and a man of faith. It would be fair to say that Mendel had a lot of grit. He persevered through difficult circumstances to make some of the most important discoveries in biology. As a young man, Mendel had difficulty paying for his education due to his family's limited means, and he also suffered bouts of physical illness and depression. Still, he persevered to graduate from high school and later college. After finishing college, he joined the Montessori, which is now the Czech Republic. At the time, the Montessori was the cultural and intellectual hub of the region, and Mendel was immediately exposed to new teachings and ideas. His decision to join the order was against the wishes of his father, who expected him to carry on the family farm. His decision appears to have been motivated in part by a desire to continue his education and pursue his scientific interest. Supported by the Montessori, he taught physics, botany, and natural science courses at the secondary and university levels. In 1856, Mendel began a decade-long research project to investigate patterns of inheritance. He began his research using mice, but later he switched to honeybees and plants, ultimately settling on garden peas as his primary model system. A model system is an organism that makes it easy for a researcher to investigate a particular scientific question, such as how are traits inherited. By studying a model system, researchers can learn genetic principles that apply to other harder-to-study organisms or biological systems, such as humans. Mendel studied the inheritance of 7 different features in peas, including height, flower color, seed color, and seed shape. To do so, he first established pea lines with 2 different forms of a feature, such as tall versus short height. He grew these lines for generations until they were purebred, then bred them to each other and observed how the traits were inherited. In addition to recording how the plants in each generation look, Mendel counted the exact number of plants that showed each trait. Strikingly, he found that very similar patterns of inheritance for all 7 features he studied. One form of a feature, such as tall, always concealed the other form, such as short, in the first generation after the cross. Mendel called the visible form the dominant trait and the hidden form the recessive trait. In the second generation, after the plants were allowed to self-fertilize, the hidden form of the trait reappeared in the minority of the plants. Specifically, there were always about 3 plants that showed the dominant trait for every 1 plant that showed the recessive trait, making a 3-to-1 ratio. Mendel also found that the features were inherited independently. One feature, such as plant height, did not influence inheritance of other features, such as flower color or seed shape. In 1865, Mendel presented the results of his experiments with nearly 30,000 pea plants to the local National History Society. Based on the patterns he observed, the counting data he collected, and a mathematical analysis of his results, Mendel proposed a model of inheritance in which characteristics such as flower color, plant height, and seed shape were controlled by pairs of inheritable factors that came in different versions. One version of a factor could mask the presence of another version. The 2 paired factors separated during gamete production such that each gamete randomly received just one factor. The factors controlling different characteristics were inherited independently of one another. Mendel's first crosses were called monohybrid crosses. He started with a set of tall pea plants from generations that had produced tall plants. He crossed this plant with a set of short pea plants from generations that had produced short plants. The tall and short plants were a part of the pea generation. The cross resulted in a F1 generation that Mendel called the hybrid. Every one of the offspring in the F1 generation were tall. Next, he created another monohybrid cross with the 2 of the hybrids from the F1 generation. The cross resulted in a F2 generation that consisted of 3 tall plants and 1 short plant. From this experiment, Mendel was able to conclude that there are at least 2 factors that control each trait. We know that these factors are genes and that they are located on chromosomes. Genes exist in alternate forms called alleles. Each of Mendel's pea plants had 2 alleles of that gene that determined height. A plant could have 2 alleles for tallness, 2 alleles for shortness, or 1 allele for tallness and 1 allele for shortness. 1 allele is inherited from the female parent and 1 from the male parent. When you're looking at alleles and you want to describe how likely it is for a certain phenotype to pass from the parent to the offspring, you say that it is either dominant or recessive. If you have a dominant allele, it is going to show their effect with 1 copy of the allele. If it is recessive, it's going to show their effect with 2 copies of the allele. If something is dominant, it's going to take over. If something is recessive, it's going to be passive. It's not going to show through as much. Mendel also observed that certain traits showed up and others seemed to disappear. He deemed one of the alleles dominant and the other recessive. In the first monohybrid cross of the pea generation, he crossed a tall and short plant. In the F1 generation, all the plants were tall. Although they were all tall, they had a hybrid genotype. Each offspring received 1 allele from the tall and 1 from the short. The allele for tallness masked the allele for shortness in the pea plants. The tall allele is therefore dominant over the short allele. To show this, we use the same letter for different alleles of the same gene. An uppercase letter is used for the dominant allele and a lowercase letter is for the recessive. The dominant allele is always written first. Mendel's law of segregation explains why hybrid offspring can occur. 2 organisms can look alike, have the same phenotype, but have different genotypes. The genotype for tall plants can be capital T or capital T lowercase t. The genotype of short is only lowercase t. If the genotype is capital T or lowercase t, then it's said to be homozygous or pure breed. If the genotype is capital T lowercase t, it is said to be heterozygous or hybrid. The only way to get a phenotype of short is to have the alleles to be the same, lowercase t. In 1905, Reginald Punnett devised a shorthanded way of finding the expected proportion of possible genotypes in the offspring of a cross. This method is called a Punnett square. It takes account of the fact that fertilization occurs randomly, as Mendel's laws of segregation states. If you know the genotype of the parents, you can use a Punnett square to predict the possible genotype of their offspring. Knowing the genotypes, you can also know the phenotype. Some interesting facts about Mendel and inheritance. Mendel's work was rejected by his fellow scientists while he was alive. It wasn't until after his work was rediscovered and confirmed through further experimentation. Mendel was a monk and performed his experiments in the Montessori garden. His experimentation largely ended when he was promoted to abbot. Mendel also ran experiments with honeybees, but found them much more difficult to experiment with. The idea that offspring receives one unit of inheritance from each parent is called the theory of segregation. I would much rather be in the classroom teaching you all face to face. I know this is not how we typically do things. Things are very different right now. I hope you all enjoy your summer. Take some time just to relax and enjoy yourself. I miss you all. I can't wait to see you. Once we come back to school, make sure that you stop and see me so I can hug your neck, welcome you back. I just want you to know that I miss you, and I can't wait to see you again soon.